Climate change has been deemed to be an environmental pandemonium that has accosted political, economic, social, and human systems. It has created a daunting challenge and dismal innovation to humanity. However, its catastrophic impacts and risks have been staved off either with adaptation solutions or mitigation approaches conducted by different institutions, agencies, and centers. Climate Smart Philippines is a platform that provides elucidations in reducing disaster risks and preventing potential damage and losses through scientific wide ranging assessment, capacity development, project management, and multilateral cooperation among stakeholders. It is an avenue for all the stakeholders to understand, plan, develop, and implement not only the best science and evidence based strategies, but also the most humane and gender responsive schemes. Climate Smart Philippines covers 81 provinces, 146 cities, 1,488 municipalities, and 42,046 barangays. And when we say Climate Smart Philippines, we have two particular approaches: climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation, navigating resilience and sustainability. So when we say climate change mitigation, we provide solutions on how greenhouse gas emissions are going to be reduced. And for climate change adaptation, this is where we assess and manage our risks. So what is the real essence of Climate Smart Philippines? First, Climate Smart Philippines applies the power of multi-stakeholder participatory mechanism. This is where we travel to different parts of the country, we train, we empower different stakeholders, we ask questions, and we do it in a focus group discussion. So in this particular approach, under the power of multi-stakeholder participatory mechanism, it is actually clustered in four ways: the biophysical assessment, the socio-economic assessment, the psychological impact assessment, and the last one is the religiosity and spirituality. Now, when we say biophysical assessment, this is where we ask our stakeholders what happened before and what is happening right now. For instance, under the biophysical assessment, how many tropical cyclones that entered PAR, a Philippine Air Responsibility, before, and how we're going to compare the number of tropical cyclones that entering Philippine Air Responsibility nowadays. How are you going to compare the temperature before and the temperature right now? And how are you going to compare the rainfall before and how are you going to compare it nowadays? Now, these are just some of the examples and we take into consideration under the biophysical assessment. The next one is about the socio-economic assessment. So when we say socio-economic assessment, this is where, for example, for our farmers, how are you going to compare your crop yields? What were their crop yields before and how are they going to compare their crop yields right now? And what about their earnings? How are we going to compare their earnings before and how are they going to compare their earnings now? And these are just some of the examples. Now, this is very interesting. The next one will be psychological impact assessment. I am not a psychologist, but we have a psychologist in our team. And under this particular approach is we wanted to measure the level of anxiety, depression, trauma that these different stakeholders experience every time there is a disaster. And one of the solutions that we had in 2013, when Super Typhoon Haiyan or Yolanda made its landfall, more than 10,000 people died. So when we went to the areas that were devastated by this particular Category 5 tropical cyclone, these are some of the answers. We found out that in terms of post-traumatic growth, all right, post-traumatic growth, we found out that the more they experience different types of hazards, the more they are exposed to different climate hazards, their post-traumatic growth is high. So if you are new to a certain disaster, if it is your first time to experience this climate hazard, therefore your post-traumatic growth is low. Now, another thing, this is very, very, very interesting. Philippines is we have so many religious sectors, religions. Now, we also found out that the people who were devastated, and the people who survived from these disasters, you know what they told us? You know what they mentioned? The reason why they were able to survive was because of their faith. And that's the reason why faith is considered to be a resilient armor for the Philippines. Now, the next thing is Harvard Climate Smart Philippines, all right? It is considered to be science and evidence-based. So we use global climate models. We use global climate models, for instance, on how we're going to provide trends and projections. We use GCMs, all right? We use GCMs to understand what's going to happen in the future. For example, in some of our provinces, we use these GCMs if we want to know if the temperature is going to increase in 30 years or in 60 years. The same thing with rainfall. What is going to happen to a certain province if the temperature and rainfall or precipitation are going to increase? That's why we use these climate models, scientific assessment to understand that. And the reason why it is also science and evidence-based, we want to make sure that the experiences of our stakeholders are properly validated. And that's the reason why we have science models and evidence and science evidence-based solutions. Another thing is we assess the risk, all right? We assess the risk. And how do we do that? In terms of climate hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. Since this is Climate Smart Philippines, in terms of assessing the risk, in terms of climate hazard, you have your tropical cyclones, you also have your flooding, we also have our sea level rise, drought, rain-induced landslides. Now, who are exposed from all these hazards or climate hazards? Number one, people. If the population is exposed from these hazards, therefore, we use particular two vulnerability parameters. We use the human poverty incidence, and the other one is the human development index. Under the HDI, or Human Development Index, we have the age, education, income. Who are more vulnerable to different types of hazards? The people who are young or the people who are old? In terms of education, who are again more vulnerable? The people who have education, or the people who don't have any training on how this climate change is going to be addressed. And the last one, who are again more vulnerable from these disasters, from these hazards? The people who are rich or the people who are poor. So summing them up, your edge, education, income, you will be able to understand your HDI, and we use that HDI to partner with your exposure and of course your climate hazard. Then you will be able to assess the risk. Now, if you ask me, oh Glenn, what about if the exposure is our asset? What about if our exposure is our building, our infrastructure? What is your vulnerability parameter? The vulnerability parameter that we use is our GDP, or gross domestic product, in terms of damages and losses. So again, if you have hazard, exposure, vulnerability, then you have the risk. So another thing, Climate Smart Philippines is people-centered. So we travel, I mentioned this a while ago, we travel different parts of the country because we train, we empower them, we empower our stakeholders. Because this particular approach or this particular advocacy cannot be done by one particular person alone. You need different stakeholders. You need the national government agencies, the local government units. You need your NGOs, your civil society organizations, the community of farmers, fisher folks, the youth, the women, the church leaders, and even the persons with disabilities. And these are the people that you have to empower and let them understand that they have the value to save the planet and to address these issues, address the impacts and risks of climate change. So what do we also do? We strengthen our collaboration with the private sector. And in the private sector, the approach is not just not just about resiliency, but we help them to address their sustainability concerns. For instance, the net zero emission roadmap. So before we can create a net zero emission roadmap for our private sector partners, what we do is to assess their greenhouse gas or their carbon footprint from the different sources, covering Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, because it's the only way for you to know way for you to know and to understand if you will be able to attain your net zero emissions by 2050. It will be very hard for a certain organization to attain net zero emission or carbon neutrality by 2050 if you don't know your baseline, if you don't know what you emit. And that's the reason why we give that particular service. So another thing I mentioned, that's for the private sector, but for the local government units, for the local communities, for our farmers, for our fisher folks, for our indigenous people, These are some of the answers that we got from them. Glenn, we are not scientists like you. Glenn, we're not policymakers. How are we going to help the environment? How can we transform the lives of our people? My answer would always be, you don't have to be a scientist like me. You don't have to be a science diplomat to make a difference. It's all about transforming your passion into action. Just think of what you can provide and not what you can get. So summing them up, under Climate Smart Philippines, in this particular program, we were able to capacitate more than 800 government agencies and local government units in the Philippines, more than 500 academe, colleges and universities, more than 500 groups from the private sector, and more than 500 groups of CSOs, NGOs, communities of farmers, fishermen, indigenous people, women, youth, church leaders, and persons with disabilities. So before I add my presentation, of all these disasters that are happening in the Philippines, Climate Smart Philippines is more than an advocacy. It is more than science, technology, innovation, and policy. Climate Smart Philippines is about bringing the people all together, not only to be trained to come up with the most sustainable and resilient solutions, but also to inspire others to serve humanity wholeheartedly. And my last message for you, of all these disasters that are happening, not only the Philippines, but all around the globe, always remember that God answers our prayers in 4 ways. Yes, 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 no, no, yes, and no, no. So what do we mean by that? Yes, yes, God, yes, I'm going to give it to you because it is good for you. No, yes, I'm not going to give it to you today because I know it's not good for you, but you're going to have it someday. Yes, no, I am going to give it to you, but not the way you want it. And no, no, I am not going to give it to you because it is not good for you. Thank you so much for listening.